A disabled boy, his mother, and his nurse are brutally murdered in the middle of the night.
You have 3 victims at one time. One of the victims being a young boy, severely brain damaged, living on a respirator.
The harrowing crime shows all the markings of a hitman.
Knew we were up against someone who was, if not professional, trying to be professional.
The boy's estranged father quickly becomes the prime suspect.
Everyone who knew Lawrence Horn said he's behind it. He either did it or he hired somebody to do it.
Police soon connect the suspect to a how-to murder manual that may have inspired him in his heinous act.
When I first saw the Hitman book, I was shocked. I did not know that publications like this existed.
The book is not a mere publication of information. The book is all about advocacy. The book is all about intentionally causing the death of others.
The affluent town of Silver Spring, Maryland is among the safest suburbs in the Washington, D.C. area. Early on the morning of March 3rd, 1993, however, Montgomery County Police received a distressing phone call. A triple murder had been committed on Northgate Drive. The victims were an 8-year-old quadriplegic boy, his mother, and his private duty nurse. As authorities videotaped the crime scene, investigators tried to piece together what had happened.
The one thing I think that we did conclude was that it was a sudden attack. Janice Saunders, the nurse, had obviously been surprised by her positioning, by the way the wounds were on her body. Trevor, of course, remained in bed. I don't know that he ever woke from this. And you could also deduce that Millie Horn, the mother, had come down the stairs, having heard something, and then was shot several times in her state of partial undress.
The nurse, Janice Saunders, and the mother, Millie Horn, both died of multiple gunshot wounds to the head. Trevor Horn had evidently been smothered to death. While there was evidence suggesting a robbery, authorities were skeptical. Everything about the crime scene showed an icy efficiency. It seemed to be the work of a hitman.
There were very, very few obvious clues about who the intruder was. There were no fingerprints left behind. There were no shell casings. We knew we were up against someone who was, if not professional, trying to be professional.
A nurse's log found near Janice Saunders' body helped place the general time of the murders. The last entry was made at 2 a.m. In the backyard bushes, police found a single clue, a rat tail file. They believe it had been used to pry open the French doors. Police had to ask themselves who would have wanted to murder these people, and why. When Millie's horrified family appeared at the crime scene, they immediately offered up a suspect, Millie's ex-husband, Lawrence Horn.
I knew he did it. He didn't have any money. He did it to cover money.
At the time, Lawrence was living in Los Angeles and had little contact with the family. But he seemed to have a motive, a $2 million bank account in Millie's and Trevor's name. Millie had known that her ex-husband was in financial trouble and desperately wanted a share of the money. She also believed he would stop at nothing to get it.
In the months before she was murdered, she was very concerned about him and articulated it and would say things like, if anything happens to me, make sure you have Lawrence checked out.
Police began their investigation by looking into the couple's background. Lawrence and Millie met in 1972 in Detroit. Lawrence was a sound engineer for Motown Records and worked closely with the company's founder, Berry Gordy. Millie was a flight attendant for American Airlines. After dating for a few months, they married in Las Vegas. About a year later, they had a daughter, Tiffany. From the beginning, their marriage was contentious. In 1979, they separated, but did not divorce. Horn transferred to Los Angeles after Motown relocated its headquarters there. Millie moved with her daughter to the Washington suburbs. She wanted to be near her sisters so that she could rely on them for support. Horn rarely visited.
They were in litigation almost constantly over issues of child support. So it certainly was not a good marriage.
However bad it may have been, the couple seemed unable to end the relationship. And in 1983, after briefly reuniting, Millie became pregnant, this time with twins. Tamiel and Trevor were born in August 1984, 12 weeks before their due date. As a result of his premature birth, Trevor's lungs were underdeveloped. He was plagued with medical problems and hospitalized frequently. During one stay at Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C. in September 1985, a tube carrying oxygen to his lungs was accidentally dislodged. The blunder left the one-year-old boy paralyzed, blind, and profoundly retarded. He needed an expensive respirator and round-the-clock medical care. By this time, Millie and Lawrence had finally divorced. Millie, as sole legal guardian of Trevor, sued Children's Hospital. During the painful period after the accident, she shouldered full responsibility for Trevor and her other two children. Lawrence, living in Los Angeles, showed no interest in his son's plight. But on the first day of the civil proceedings in Washington, D.C., he suddenly appeared. Horn confronted Millie's lawyers in the hallway. He demanded a share of any settlement money.
I went ballistic and said, "What makes you think you're entitled to a nickel of this child's money?" And he looked me in the eye and he said, "Trevor lives through me." I left that courtroom and I said, I have just been face to face with pure evil. This guy scares me.
In 1990, the lawyers won an out-of-court settlement of $2 million for the lifelong care of Trevor. The money was put into a trust fund in the boy's name. The cash settlement ensured that Trevor would receive 24-hour care at home. Millie resumed her job as a flight attendant. Trevor's twin sister, Tamiel, would often stay with her aunt nearby, and Millie's oldest daughter, Tiffany, went off to college. Lawrence Horn did receive $125,000 of the settlement money. The judge also ruled that if Trevor and Millie both were to die before Mr. Horn, the remaining $1.8 million would go to him. Hello, I'm Bill Curtis. As police now launched their investigation into the gruesome triple homicide, the suspicions of the family seemed to be correct. All the evidence suggested that Lawrence Horn was involved, except for one fact. Horn had a most curious alibi: a videotape of himself watching TV in Los Angeles at the very time the murders took place. The search widened, eventually linking Horn to a violent felon and to a book called Hitman, a shocking how-to manual that explains in minute detail how to stalk, kill, and dispose of a victim without getting caught. On March 3rd, 1993, an intruder broke into a home in Silver Spring, Maryland, and murdered Millie Horn, her 8-year-old quadriplegic son, and the boy's at-home nurse. Members of Millie's family were certain that her former husband, Lawrence Horn, was behind the triple homicide. The alleged motive, a $2 million settlement from the hospital that caused the boy's severe retardation.
I hesitate to say that we suspected Mr. Horn right away, but I think some of us did. I think that once we learned about the trust fund, we felt that it was very important that we at least go out and talk to him and eliminate him if possible.
A few days after the murder, Detective James Leisure traveled to Los Angeles. He had a warrant to search Horn's Hollywood apartment. The police entered while he was at work. Next to the phone, they found a hand-drawn map of Millie's Silver Spring neighborhood, with her address scribbled in the margins. They also discovered a stack of home videos. One of them showed Horn driving the route from his ex-wife's house to a Days Inn a few miles away. While police were conducting their search, Horn returned home. He reacted angrily and refused to answer any questions. He did, however, produce one piece of evidence, a videotape of himself watching television the night of the murders.
He had pointed the video camera at his television set, viewing a television program which indicated the date and the time. He also would walk in front of the camera, so there was absolutely no doubt in your mind where he was that particular night.
In a phone interview with American Justice, Horn tried to explain his reasoning for filming the TV screen that night.
Whenever I tape things, I would timestamp it or date it in some way to indicate, when the tape was done. The authorities failed to also show the dozens of other tapes over the previous years that I had time dated the same way.
And yet, for police, this so-called videotape alibi only confirmed their suspicions that Horn had somehow been involved. Perhaps he had hired a hitman to carry out the murders. They broadened their investigation.
One thing that we did was to look at the telephone records of Lawrence Horn himself in Los Angeles. And we saw that he made a number of phone calls to hotels in the area, several in the Rockville area, several in the Silver Spring area. We thought it was unusual that the night of the murders he was calling hotels in Maryland.
Police then checked to see if there were any calls made from payphones near the crime scene to Horn's house.
And lo and behold, there was a phone call made approximately midnight, literally hours before the murder, from a payphone by a Days Inn on Shady Grove Road in Rockville.
Police obtained a list of all the guests who had stayed at the Days Inn the night of the murders. One person stood out from the others, a man by the name of James Perry.
James Perry checked in approximately midnight and checked out at 6 a.m. on March the 3rd. And he was required to leave his driver's license, and they had a Xerox copy of that driver's license. That's hotel policy. He was from Detroit. We thought that was interesting because Lawrence Horn originally was from Detroit.
Detective Leisure contacted Perry by phone and questioned him about his presence at the Days Inn on March 3rd, 1993.
Is there anybody that we could speak to down here, basically, to verify that, why you were here?
If it becomes necessary, then I can do that. But I'm not going to get into that with you because evidently I am under investigation.
You all drove down, I assume.
No, we caught a plane.
Oh, you caught a plane? What airline did you travel with that day?
Sir, I'm not going to get into this with you. You have to follow your investigation and do what you have to do.
That's what I'm trying to do, sir.
I understand that, but I'm not going to get into that with you at this particular time.
Okay.
Perry's refusal to cooperate, coupled with his shady past, only further persuaded authorities that he was the hitman.
James Perry had served time in the Michigan correction system for some violent crimes, particularly armed robbery. And we learned that he was putting himself out as a minister, as a doctor, had a business card, called himself a spiritual advisor.
Investigators placed both James Perry and Lawrence Horn under surveillance. During the months after the murders, they communicated at least 25 times. They called each other from different public phone booths in the belief that police would not be able to link them. During one conversation, Horn mentioned a money order. Investigators called Western Union. The company searched for any checks issued to Perry since the March 3rd slayings. Western Union eventually found money orders totaling $6,000. The sender, Lawrence Horn. Investigators were now convinced Horn had hired Perry as a contract killer, but neither man had any idea that he was under surveillance. In June 1994, Horn decided to move forward with his claim on the remainder of his son Trevor's $2 million hospital settlement. Millie's sisters filed a civil suit to block his claim, and Horn was forced to testify in a deposition. Civil attorneys, tipped off by police, took Horn by surprise and pressed him about his relationship with James Perry.
Until today, did you know that Mr. Perry was in Montgomery County, Maryland on the night of the murder of your former wife and child and the nurse?
No.
Okay. Have you ever met Mr. Perry?
No.
Have you ever spoken to Mr. Perry?
No.
You've never had a telephone conversation with Mr. Perry?
No.
You've never met him personally?
No.
His 2-day deposition, it was so full of lies regarding his knowledge of a James Perry that we felt that that would be useful in our trial as well.
With Horn caught in a web of lies, and with a financial link between the two men now confirmed, police got a warrant to search Perry's house. The hunt turned up a large stack of books, catalogs, and magazines on murder, weaponry, and crime. An odd collection for a man who called himself a spiritual advisor. One item in particular stuck out. It was a mail-order catalog for a book publishing company called Paladin Press. Inside was a list of more than 50 instructional books with titles like Be Your Own Undertaker, How to Dispose of a Dead Body, The Combat Use of the Double-Edged Fighting Knife, and The Ancient Art of Strangulation. Police knew it was a long shot, but they contacted Paladin Press in Boulder, Colorado, to see whether any books had ever been mailed to James Perry.
And they said, oh, yes, we did. Back in 1992, we did. Here's his check. It bounced. Here's his order form. And we mailed him the book on how to be a hitman.
Police immediately got hold of a copy of the book, Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors.
When I first saw the Hitman book, I was shocked. I did not know that publications like this existed. There were articles on how to make a silencer, for example. I would never know how to make a silencer, even in my position as a police officer.
It was so cold-blooded. It was so detailed. It had no pretense of any kind of a fiction. It blew us away at how brazen it was in its effort to teach people how to kill people.
Even more startling than the book's contents was the way it read as a blueprint for the murders committed at the Horn residence. Investigators noted 22 parallels between the recommendations made in Hitman and the triple murder committed on March 3, 1993.
The book counsels that you stand 3 feet or slightly more away from your victim and shoot him in the eyes. And the reason for that 3 feet is to avoid any blood from the victim's head getting on your clothing. And the forensics showed that Mr. Perry was almost exactly 3 feet from Millie Horn when he shot her 3 times in the head, once through the eyes.
Hitman also suggests using the relatively obscure AR-7 rifle rather than a pistol or other weapon.
An AR-7 is a .22 caliber rifle that can be disassembled with the pieces placed in the stock of the gun. It's small, it's light, it uses .22 caliber long rifle ammunition, and as it turns out, that is the ammunition that was used to kill Janice Saunders and Mildred Horn.
The book instructs the reader to use a drill to obscure the serial number of the murder weapon before disposing of it. This way, the gun can't be traced. This bit of information answered a crucial riddle. Several days after the murders, police found a piece of an AR-7 along the road a few miles from Millie's house. Its serial number had been drilled out. The similarities between the crime and Hitman were overwhelming. It was a final link needed to finally press charges against James Perry and Lawrence Horn. On July 20th, 1994, the two men were arrested. James Perry and Lawrence Horn were each charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. If found guilty, both faced the death penalty. No one actually saw James Perry enter Millie's house, and no one doubted that Lawrence Horn was in Los Angeles the night of the murders. Still, prosecutors were convinced they had a solid case and that the book Hitman held all the loose ends together. But would the jury believe that a book linked the two men to the scene of the crime? In September 1995, jurors in Rockville, Maryland, heard opening arguments in the trial of James Perry. The state alleged that he was a contract killer who had used a how-to manual to kill 3 people in nearby Silver Spring. Prosecutors contended that Perry had been hired by a man named Lawrence Horn to murder Horn's ex-wife, his quadriplegic son, and a private duty nurse. The defense had a weak case and focused its efforts on saving Perry from the death penalty.
This was a long uphill battle. You had 3 victims at one time, one of the victims being a young boy, severely brain damaged, living on a respirator, and also the fact that the nurse was present and got killed as well.
The defense tried to argue that Perry had nothing to do with the triple homicide and was only in the area for a business trip on March 3, 1993. The lead prosecutors wasted no time debunking that story and went on to present their version of events. Sometime after 2 a.m., Perry pried open the back door of the house with a rat tail file. He entered Trevor's bedroom, surprising Nurse Jenna Saunders as she sat knitting a quilt. Perry shot her twice through the right eye with an AR-7 rifle. He then walked over to Trevor's crib and removed his oxygen tube. Perhaps unexpectedly, his action set off a loud, bleeding alarm. It may have been this noise that woke Millie, who was sleeping in her room. She ran downstairs, only to be greeted by Perry. He shot her 3 times, then tore the house apart to make it look like a robbery. He fled the scene, disposing of his gun and silencer along the way. Prosecutors pointed out that much of the crime followed advice offered in the book Hitman. Ironically, it was one suggestion Perry did not follow that led police to him in the first place. Don't use your real name when carrying out a hit.
At the hotel, he provided a driver's license, which was in fact Xeroxed. Outside of this, the book was pretty much followed from A to Z to the letter.
Perry's lawyers tried to soften the impact of the Hitman book by claiming that the information contained in the 120-page manual was commonplace.
It struck me after I read it a couple times that you could find out how to do what it was telling you how to do in, if you've read any books by Frederick Forsyth or Tom Clancy or any of the other spy authors. I mean, they all tell you how to get different IDs and how to kill people and how to cover it up.
This attempt to discredit the Hitman book did little to save his client. On October 12, 1995, after only 5 hours of deliberation, Perry was convicted of triple murder. 4 days later, he was sentenced to die by lethal injection. The trial of Lawrence Horn began 6 months later, in April 1996. He too faced a possible death sentence. Prosecutors relied on several videotapes to paint Horn as a cold-blooded killer who plotted for over a year to murder his ex-wife and handicapped child. The first tape was one Horn himself had made. It showed him driving the route from Millie's house to the Days Inn where Perry had stayed the night of the murders. The state argued that Horn recorded the trip in early 1992 to show Perry the getaway route after the slaying. Horn taped it during a weekend visit with his two daughters, who rode innocently along with him.
Okay. Bye, baby. Okay.
Horn also had Tiffany, his oldest daughter, videotape the interior of the house on the pretext he wanted to show his mother what it looked like. The prosecutors insisted the real purpose was to aid Perry in his crime. The other videotape of Horn's 1994 civil deposition was used to devastating effect. While the investigation was still going on, he had foolishly tried to claim his son Trevor's $1.7 million estate. During the two-day questioning, Horn was caught in a series of flagrant lies.
It includes a picture of James Edward Perry. Have you ever seen this gentleman before?
No.
Horn later admitted that he had lied about his knowledge of James Perry, but said he did so because he had hired Perry as a confidential spiritual advisor, not as a hitman. Horn's assertion that he was innocent did little to sway the jury. It took them only 7.5 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all charges. But unlike James Perry, Horn was spared the death penalty and given life in prison instead. The sentencing outraged the victims' families, including his own daughter.
I'll never have a relationship with him, so why spare his life? He killed my mom, he killed my brother, and he left me and Tamiel with nothing. So as far as I'm concerned, he's dead already.
We were hoping for some kind of peace. Peace. And it's not there.
Even though the two killers were now in prison, the victims' families believed there was still one more guilty party at large, the publisher of the how-to book that had aided them in their crime. The Hitman case would set off a firestorm of controversy over the limits of free speech. In May 1996, a jury ruled that Lawrence Horn was guilty of hiring a hitman to kill his ex-wife, handicapped son, and his son's nurse. He was sentenced to life in prison. The convicted hitman, James Perry, was given the death penalty. In the trial, prosecutors argued that Perry had used the book Hitman as a blueprint to commit the murders. Now the families of the victims decided to sue Paladin Press, the book's publisher.
We never set out to ban books or to destroy the Constitution or these other crazy things. Our point always from the beginning was anybody that is responsible for these murders, whether they carried them out, they planned them, they aided and abetted, they intended for things to happen, those people should be punished.
The victims' families went back to the attorneys who had helped them in the past.
When speech becomes the vehicle with which to commit a crime, the First Amendment has no shelter. Never has, never will.
To prevail in court, however, the lawyers realized they needed an expert, someone known as a defender of the First Amendment. They contacted Rod Smola, a highly respected attorney who had written several books on the subject.
My instant reaction was, no, there's a thing called the First Amendment, and you can't sue books, and you can't sue book publishers, and I'm sympathetic to you and sympathetic to the members of the family, but I just don't see how it can be done.
But the family's attorneys were persistent. They sent Smola a copy of Hitman and requested that he read the book before making a final decision.
I'll never forget, I read this book, and I was so just depressed. I was stunned by the detail in the book, the cold-bloodedness of it, the calculating quality of it. I remember I couldn't leave the book next to my bedstand that night. It was like it was giving off evil vibrations.
Smola came to the conclusion that while Paladin has the right to publish books like Hitman, they should also be held responsible for any actions that occur because of its publication. He agreed to join the team. Together, they filed a suit in the name of the victim's surviving family members. A judge would rule whether the case could proceed to trial. In the meantime, the lawyers investigated the publisher's background. Paladin Press was the brainchild of a man named Peter Lund. Lund launched the company in 1970 and in time turned it into a successful publishing house with more than 350 titles. Most of its books were how-to manuals on terrorism, smuggling, and political assassination. In 1995, Paladin gained notoriety when one of its publications was found on the shelf of Timothy McVeigh, the man later convicted of the Oklahoma City bombing. Hitman was first published in 1983. The author's name, Rex Farrell, a Latin term meaning King of the Beasts, was an obvious pseudonym. When the plaintiff's attorneys set out to discover who the real writer was, they were in for a great surprise. Documents subpoenaed from Paladin showed that Rex Farrell was a single mother living in Florida and whose identity is shielded to this day. When Paladin commissioned her to write the book, the author worried that the information she supplied could one day incriminate her if anyone acted on the book's advice. Paladin assured her she would never be held accountable.
The first time in the history of Paladin, Paladin agreed to indemnify, another word for hold harmless, to pay for any monies that the author had to pay if she was sued successfully by a victim of a crime in which Hitman was used.
On July 22, 1996, the plaintiffs presented their evidence at a pretrial hearing in Greenbelt, Maryland. They argued that Paladin's promise to protect its author was an implicit admission of guilt.
That was powerful evidence that Paladin knew that this book would cause death and destruction, that they intended for it to happen, that they foresaw it to the point that they let the one who wrote the book off the hook.
Paladin's attorneys insisted that the First Amendment protected the company from liability for the actions of a hitman. Therefore, they insisted, the suit against them was baseless, and the case should not be allowed to proceed to trial. After both sides presented their arguments, the case became the subject of intense debate among constitutional scholars around the country.
Commercial publishers publish books to make money, but beyond that, they don't have any specific intent. A cookbook publisher, for instance, doesn't expect that a reader's going to cook every recipe or maybe any of the recipes.
When you publish a book that says how to make a chocolate cake, your expectation is that the people who buy it are going to make a chocolate cake. When you publish a set of instructions on how to slaughter innocent women and children, don't come to me and say, oh, I had no idea it was going to happen.
The plaintiffs compelled Paladin's president, Peter Lund, to come to Maryland and give a deposition. During the questioning, Lund was required to read descriptions of the books in his most recent catalog.
How's a baby bottle bomb work?
I have no idea.
You know whether it's used to blow up babies?
Mr. Siegel, you better read the book if you want to blow up a baby. I don't know.
No, I don't want to, but somebody that reads that book might want to. Don't you think so?
Possibly.
Okay.
In a move that took plaintiffs by surprise, Lund admitted that he published Hitman with the intention to assist contract killers. He also showed little remorse for anyone who might be endangered by advice offered in his books.
Mr. Lund, does it matter to you for what purpose your books are being ordered when you sell them?
No.
Do you care?
No.
In a way, it was kind of a kamikaze action for Paladin to make the statement, we intended the book to be used for this purpose. It doesn't matter what we intended. The fact is we didn't go out and pull the trigger, and we should not be held liable for the consequences of somebody else reading our book and using this information for an improper purpose.
First Amendment experts who raced to Paladin's defense also tried to paint Hitman as a frivolous piece of pulp fiction masquerading as a how-to manual.
I found the book ridiculous myself. It's written in this incredibly breathless tone, sort of an X-Files type approach. The diagrams in it reminded me of something that you would have seen in the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. And the notion that you could take a book like this seriously strikes me as pretty improbable.
Lund's lawyers, of course, had conducted their own investigation into past First Amendment cases in their effort to undermine the lawsuit. They studied a landmark decision involving the Ku Klux Klan. In 1969, the state of Ohio sued a Klan leader for making a speech that advocated the murder of minorities. The case made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled that since the speech hadn't posed any immediate physical threat to anyone, the Klan was protected by the First Amendment. The defense team for Paladin Press claimed the Ohio ruling set a precedent that applied to their case. More than a year had passed between the time Perry purchased Hitman in 1992 and the actual slayings on March 3rd, 1993. The lag time, they claimed, made the suit against them groundless. The plaintiffs countered that detailed planning was a fundamental part of any murder conspiracy.
The whole idea of a Hitman book is you take months to plan it out, you case the joint, you walk through your mark, you figure out exactly the best way to get in, the best way to get out, and that it's silly to say there has to be a very close connection in time between the publication of the book and the murder, when the whole point of the book is to have you be deliberate and take your time about it.
But on August 30th, the district court ruled that Paladin was indeed protected by the First Amendment, and that the case could not proceed to trial. The judge concluded that Hitman did not encourage readers to go out and immediately commit a murder. The plaintiffs quickly appealed the verdict. They prepared themselves for a long fight, all the way to the Supreme Court, if necessary. Publishing companies and news organizations were nervously following the case. If a higher court decided that a publisher could be held responsible for a reader's response to a book, what precedent might it set? Would it be open season on other kinds of unpopular speech? In November 1997, a Maryland court ruled that the publishers of the how-to murder manual, Hitman, could not be sued after one of its readers used the information to kill a young boy, his mother, and at-home nurse. Applauding Paladin Press in its victory was a long list of First Amendment experts. While none would defend the merits of the book itself, they all asserted that it should be granted full protection by the Constitution.
The amendments to the Constitution exist to protect our fundamental rights, and they are there to defend controversial and unpopular speech. It's the stuff on the edge, it's the stuff on the margins that has to have First Amendment protection. So in that sense, something like Hitman is the poster child for the First Amendment.
The plaintiffs suing Paladin held a different perspective. They wasted no time appealing the decision.
Our argument was this is not about censorship, that we're not suing the publisher for putting out stuff that most people will find repugnant. Our argument was this is about holding you responsible for training people to kill people. And you have a right to be repugnant, but the First Amendment's not a license to kill.
This time, the team's argument appeared to fall on more receptive ears. One of the circuit court judges, J. Michael Ludig, had a father who had been brutally murdered.
I think the Paladin Press people drew an unfortunate choice of judges. I think Judge Ludwig had obviously been touched, as anybody would be, by the murder of his father. And I think he was emotional, and I think he read this book in a certain way.
On November 10th, the three-judge panel reversed the lower court's decision. They announced that the case did have merit and could proceed to trial. Paladin quickly appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it denied the petition. The Hitman trial was scheduled to begin in May 1999. Most observers felt certain that Paladin would prevail, even though its books contained repellent information intended to aid would-be murderers. On April 20th, 1999, something happened to change the dynamic. Two students opened fire at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. The massacre set off a maelstrom of debate about protecting children from violence in the media. Paladin's insurance company grew nervous and pressed Paladin President Peter Lund to settle out of court. 3 days before the trial was to begin, Lund's team made an offer to the victims' families. Paladin Press agreed to take Hitman off the market immediately and to pay the two families in the case $2.5 million each.
Peter Lund folded like a cheap suit. He decided he wanted to keep his business. This settlement was a victory. It was a total and complete surrender by the First Amendment community and by Paladin Press.
I think we've reaffirmed the First Amendment and what it's supposed to represent, and that's why I'll come back. There should be a safety concern for mothers and paralyzed children, too, that weighs in there with the need to be able to print anything you want to and say it's protected.
Many worry that the settlement will open the floodgates and suddenly a wide range of movies, books, and television shows will be under attack for inciting people to violence. The plaintiffs in the Hitman case insist no such wide precedent has been set.
The most important thing is the intent of the author and the intent of the people that have put it in the marketplace. Of course, authors who write novels and movie producers who produce movies are not intending for people to use those as training manuals for violence.
Yet other First Amendment experts disagree. They fear the case will unleash a legal witch hunt.
If you start this chain of saying, well, this book caused this to happen, then it's very easy to say, well, now we need to go back to the public school system that produced this individual and figure out whether there was something they could have done in his formative years to have kept him from turning into this awful person. If they didn't do what they should have done, well, then maybe we ought to have a cause of action against them for not having educated him properly. And what about his parents? Are they still around? Aren't they responsible for what he turned into? Let's sue his parents, too, and make them pay. Where does it stop?
The legacy of this groundbreaking decision is still being debated. It states that publishers can be sued for works that aid and abet criminal activities. Some legal scholars say the ruling sets a dangerous precedent that could ultimately weaken the First Amendment. They believe publishers and artists, fearful of expensive lawsuits, will stop producing valuable works that others might see as too provocative. In the meantime, the conviction of James Perry, the hitman who was sentenced to die for the triple murder, was overturned in December 1999. Maryland's highest court ruled that a wiretapped conversation between Perry and Lawrence Horn was inadmissible. Perry is being held pending a new trial. Horn's conviction was not affected by the ruling. He is currently serving 3 life sentences.